Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Erica Kovacs. Thank you very much for the invitation, Raj, Christina, Teresa. It's a pleasure to be here. I spent most of my life in Brazil, and I'm here to talk. It's only 1 hour, a little bit less than 1 hour to talk such a broad topic. So my goal here is to show more tools that can be used to the students to guide them and to guide you as well how to use these tools and how I use these tools with my students too, and talk also a little bit about doing business in South America. So I am here at Kelley School of Business in Bloomington, Indiana. I've been here for 6 years. This is a little bit about my life. So I was born and raised. I was born in São Paulo, which is huge, about 17 million people in the whole area. Then later on, I moved to the northeast of Brazil, which is this photo here on the bottom left. Actually, you can see my house here, 3 blocks away from the beach. Great city to live, just curiosity, like the highest number of shark attacks is in Recife. Then I also lived in Fargo, North Dakota. I spent a year in Fargo, North Dakota. Then I was in Atlanta, and I moved to Bloomington a few years ago, 6 years ago, actually. So I have a lot of, I did my master's in my, actually 1 MBA and 1 master's in international business. Then I finished my PhD in 2009, and I was at Georgia for a year in 2016, as Raj already mentioned. So I'm very passionate about international business. I used to take executives abroad or find executives in different countries to bring them to Brazil, and that really shows how cultural differences, they matter, and they are very important, and especially to open up our students' eyes about those differences. For example, the highest number of expat failure is Americans going to the UK, because we seem to be so similar, but at the same time, we have a lot of cultural differences. So here at Kelley, this is one of the classes that I teach, cross-cultural management, and we have all our students, over 10,000 students, they are required to take a class on cross-country analysis. So they take 3 international business courses, all regardless of their major and co-major, and I coordinate these country analysis courses that are have the goal of showing them that doing business, for example, in Brazil is different than here in the US, or doing business in China, and we have many different regions or countries, and most of them, all of them explore the same tools that I'm going to show you here. So I've been teaching for a long time. I did quite a lot of consulting that brought a lot of experience that supports my academic background as well. So I'm going to start talking about South America. Whenever we do a presentation or we meet somebody in, I would say, most countries in South America, it's much more relationship oriented and task oriented. So we introduce the family as well. So this is very important when conducting business, or to establish a trust, because the way we trust here in the US is very cognitive based. So I trust you because you are, you have great grades, or because you are a high performer. Why in Brazil or some other South American countries or relationship oriented countries, you trust based on who you are. Do we have a connection? Who do you know? Or who is your family? So this is my family, and talking about international business, my son lives in Germany. My daughter-in-law is from Poland. My parents live in the Netherlands. I have a sister in Brazil. I'm getting married with an American. So it's a melting pot, and just my family itself is a cross-cultural experiment. Yes, but this is important in South America to show who you are. not only your academic background, your experience, but who you are as a person. So I would say this is the first step. Actually, when I used to teach in Brazil, and I still teach there sometimes, and I have groups of Brazilians who come here and they were like, oh, it's so different how professors introduce themselves while here in the US. It seems that they are showing off who they are. Is like, no, this is very important because here we are so egalitarian. So you have to prove who you are, show all your degrees, and then you get into business. Why in Brazil, they don't even introduce themselves. If they are teaching, it's because of the status orientation, and they'll build some relationship with the students in terms of not the task orientation, their degrees, but in terms of who they are and how they can be trusted in a more not cognitive, in a more like emotionally way. So talking about South America, and this is extremely important. We put South America, or sometimes Latin America has many more countries, as in a box. They have some similarities, but they are very different as well. Even here in the US, well, if we do business in Georgia, or if we do business in Indiana or New York, it's very different. So, and we speak all the same language. You can imagine that in South America, it's much more complex. There are 12 sovereign states. So Argentina, here you have Bolivia, Brazil, which is the largest country, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Paraguay, Peru, Suriname, Uruguay, and Venezuela. And there are 2 small foreign territories, which is the Falkland Islands from the United Kingdom and the French-owned French Guiana. So there are many different languages. You can find Dutch, you can find French, you can find English, but Spanish and Portuguese are the dominant languages. And of course, language is a very important part of culture. It helps us. We are so direct here in the US. Part of that is because of our language. We say what we mean what we say. While in Spanish or Portuguese, especially Portuguese, it's much more high context. You don't really mean what you say. You have to understand in between the lines to get the message. It's funny because I was translating some slides from English to Portuguese, and while in English we had like 2 sentences, in Portuguese, and this is the automatic translator on PowerPoint, when you translate from English 2 sentences, it would go to 5 or 6 in Portuguese to show how much more indirect and high context Portuguese is. So this is an important aspect of doing business and understanding the culture. So for example, I take students to Brazil. I took a group of MBA Kelley Direct students in January. And during one of the visits, it was supposed to be from 9 to 11. Of course, we got there at 9. They had some coffee, some food. We didn't start at 9. We started at 9:30, which is very uncomfortable for us here in the US. We start exactly on time, so we were very late. And then instead of finishing at 11, at 12:30, we were still hearing the executives talk, and one of the executives came to me, well, the CEO actually came and talked to me and said, Erica, is it okay if we stay until 1 p.m.? And the students were looking at me, it's like, of course not. But this is an example of a very high context and indirect. I said, yes, of course, take as much time as you want. He wasn't asking me. He was informing that that he was going to be even more late. And it was just a way of asking, but not asking. So this is very important in South America. Understand what they mean, and many times it's not by what they are saying. Yes, it's much more complex than that. So, and the other thing is the concept of time. And if I said, yes, we have to go now, or no, you cannot continue, we would break the relationship with the company. And whenever we go there again, we would never be able to be hosted by them because of their question that was a statement. It wasn't a question. So this is important. There are many challenges. I put this photo here of a fortress. I have a very good friend that she is a CEO for Latin America, not only South America. And she would explain that she would tell me that most of the countries in South America are like a fortress. Very, very hard to get in, very, very hard to get inside the fortress. But when you are in, you don't want to get out. Yes, because there are many opportunities, but many challenges. And the challenges would be how to get into the fortress. So one of them would be political instability in some countries. Some countries are more stable than others, but in some others, for example, yesterday was the Independence Day of Brazil. There were some protests. They were sending money to the former president as a form of protest. Another challenge, but can be an opportunity, is the economic inequality, depending on what type of business you're taking there. And the other one is the environmental issues, especially on the Amazon forest. So I would say, well, doing business in South America is very rewarding, but challenging at the same time. And once you're in, there are many, many different opportunities. In terms of numbers, well, Brazil, as we saw in the map, is the largest. Half of the land mass and almost half of the population. In the population today in South America, it's approximately 431 million people, so many, many opportunities. Largest city would be São Paulo, 14 million people, just the center. If you consider the suburbs, would be almost 20 million people. 90% of the population is Christian, but you have a lot of ethnic demography varying according to the country, especially because of the history background, the way they were colonized, the way they had immigration waves. And the largest economies, I would say Brazil, Argentina, which now has an inflation to more than 100%, Colombia, Chile, and Peru. So when we are teaching our students, and some of the tools are very important, is to do a country analysis. And culture is part of that, but it's not the only factor. So, and as I mentioned, we have these culture, like the cross-country analysis in all our undergraduate students. There are some key factors. So first of them, what are the cultural and language diversity in the country? And of course, language is tied to the cultural diversity. How is the legal environment and the taxes in the country? So we have many cases of companies that struggled, especially I would say in Brazil, like McDonald's, that use the same way of hiring employees in Brazil. They were not completely adapted to the Brazilian law, and they had a huge penalty, I would say here in the 80s, not now. Political instability or stability, this is an important factor too. Fourth one would be the economical conditions. We are dealing here in South America with 14 different currencies. I was just reading this morning how the dollar got stronger in Brazil because of the results that we're presenting about the US, and then it's impacted, but it's not only Brazil. You have 13 other currencies to worry about, and what is the right time to send your money or have your money back. And the last one, I would say, is corruption and transparency, which unfortunately exists. Well, there is no country that is zero corruption, but I would say some countries are very low in the corruption and index in South America. So, oh, now I can work on my camera. Okay, now you can see me. All right. So let's start. I left culture to the end, talking about economical conditions of these countries. Things to be concerned, and this is something we have to teach our students, and they tend to use ChatGPT a lot now, and I actually stimulate the use of ChatGPT for some resources of country analysis, but the data is from 2021. Especially in South America, with so many changes, this is totally outdated. In 2 years, so many different things happen. The currency might change from one day to another week. So we have to be looking into more up-to-date data. But things to take in consideration: inflation, yes, the currency stability, how diversified is the economy. And once again, when we put all the countries in the same box, there are a lot of differences in terms of what is their main product, what is their industry. The other one would be interest rate. So there's a lot of shift now, foreign capital going to South America. Brazil was paying 14% on fixed interest rate, like in for investments in the interest rate. But on the other hand, the interest rate for loans is much higher. What are the trade policies? And then I would say economic freedom is an important one. So for example, Argentina right now has an inflation. You go to Argentina, all the restaurants are full. People are going out, they are spending all their money. This is another characteristic of many of the South American cultures. It's a cultural characteristic. They are more of a spending culture than a saving culture, and more short-term orientation. So with the inflation of 116% per year, why would you save your money if tomorrow your money is not worth as much? The investment rate that you have is not as high. So people are just spending, and as soon as they get their salaries, because that's how they will make the best out of their salaries. Venezuela was right now, well, last year was great, 234% compared to what it was in 2019, where they had more than 300,000%. Actually, Brazil had 2,000% before 94. And that brings another cultural dimension as well. If you think about inflation, that leads a lot on how people behave. So I would say, even though inflation is under control, and for the first year, the inflation in Brazil was lower than the US, there still brings some historical characteristics, historical impact on how people behave. For example, Walmart, when they went to Brazil, they struggled with seasonality, and still do. All the stores are very full at the beginning of the month when people get their salaries. And even though inflation is under control, but this is based on the past. You would go to the grocery store, spend all your money, and you'd save in groceries. So you buy everything in things that are not perishable, and then you are saving, you are using your money in the best way. So still today, a lot of Brazilians, especially my generation or older than me, they still have this cultural aspect of shopping at a certain period of time, mostly in not saving as much. So, and then the exports. A good tool for you to use with your students is the Index of Economic Freedom. Once again, this is updated every year, but they need to do additional search on more actual data, something that is happening this month or last month, because this is a static, once a year updated source of information. So this is, let me share the other screen here, so you can. Can you see my screen of the economic freedom? Yes? So this is a great source to use with your students. You can actually look here, the heat map of economic freedom. And they have the country. So here, all South America, you can see that most countries in South America and in Latin America, they tend to be less free economically than, for example, here in North America or in Europe. And this source of information brings, brings some actual important data on how to help students navigate that. So if we go to the rankings, we can also see the rankings, and if they are becoming more free, less free. And it's divided in 4 different groups. So for example, is the country more rule of law or rule of man? What is the government size? And here includes the tax burden or government spending, which is very high in Brazil, or regulatory efficiency in open markets. So this is a good source of information, and I use that with my students whenever they are doing their country analysis. They have to use this source of information and update with more recent data for their country analysis. So moving on. Moving on to another source of information that is extremely important. So here you can see the graph, and I put here the largest economies in this graph. Here, for example, we can see the trend. We have Chile. So Chile, as I mentioned, the countries in South America or in Latin America can be so different in all these data, in all these sources of information for the country analysis. So Chile, it's much more economically free than if you compare to Bolivia here or to Argentina as well here. And this is the average of the world. Yeah, so the red one would be the world, and you can create graphs and use that in all these different topics. So these 4 categories, they have they have 12 different items, and you can compare the country, and that will be helpful for the students to make a decision and to create a better country analysis. Then we move to corruption and transparency. And this is corruption in South America. We can see the situation in Venezuela, but I would say except for Chile, right here, we have a lot of corruption in South America. And here you have the score. And this is another source of information that's very important, is Transparency International, where you can compare also the trends, if the country is becoming more corrupt or less corrupt. What is the, and once again, this index is a perception of corruption. We cannot measure the actual corruption of a country, while the economic freedom or the political freedom, it's actual data. This one is just an estimate of what is the perception of that country. And of course, that impacts a lot of how people behave and impacts the culture as well. There is a very interesting series on Netflix called The Mechanism. It's only one season, maybe 8 or 10 episodes, and it shows how corruption is embedded in the society, and you can see a lot of the cultural aspects that are brought by corruption. The other source that it's important when doing business in South America or in any other country is to do some research about the political stability of the country. So there is another index from Freedom House that it's called Political Freedom, and it's divided in 2 different groups, and you can see if the country is not free, partially free, and free, which is interesting because a lot of the countries in South America, they are more free. They are not free economically, but more free in terms of political situation. And here you can also find information about the internet freedom. So I really think this is a very important tool for students as well to map this. And also you can see if the countries are becoming more free or less free. And so, for example, in Latin America, interestingly, in South America, most countries are becoming less free or stable. Very few countries becoming more free. And there is a lot of data, information, qualitative information on the source that can help you navigate and can help the students to understand why the country is, what's going on with the country. And once again, when we talk about culture, all these factors influence culture. Yes, the political environment, the economic environment, the institutions, the corruption, that all, language, it all impacts culture as a whole. So moving on, for the political environment, something that is very important is to understand what's happening in the country more recently. Once again, the political freedom, economic freedom, it's only once a year that it's updated, while other things are happening. For example, the elections in Argentina are next month, October 22nd. There is a lot of protests going on. It's going to be an interesting election. Let's say the inflation rate is very high and we don't know what's going to happen. And one single factor might impact a lot in terms of the trends of doing business in that country or not. So actually, I always ask, whenever I'm teaching the country analysis class, I ask my students to look for news and bring it to class of something that is happening in the country within the last 3 months, and they have to present and relate to the theories, and that helps them to be more updated, because those things matter. So moving on, in terms of legal and regulatory environment, that's when it really gets different, and that's very hard to put South America in one bucket. You have a lot of differences between labor laws. While Brazil is much more protective for workers, there are many unions. It's one of the highest countries, well, with the highest number of legal actions, lawsuits against workers, against employees. Chile is much more flexible. So Chile has more flexible labor laws. Taxes are very different too. In Brazil, it takes more than 2,000 hours just to calculate your taxes per year. In Colombia, you have some preferential tax rates as well, depending on your industry and who you are, where you are located. In Uruguay, even though it's smaller, it's much more transparent and has a much more stable, understandable tax system. And the other concern is IP protection. While Chile is very strong in that, Peru and Argentina, they have the IP protection laws, but enforcement can be a challenge. And I would say a lot of the environmental policies in most countries, including Brazil, many laws, but the enforcement is a challenge, especially because of the size. So it's important to go deep into these countries and see how they are. So also that brings some cultural influence. I would say in Brazil, because you cannot be, it's not that easy to be fired depending on where you work. And if you're working for the government, there's a lot of impact on how people behave. It's more in terms of efficiency. So that brings a lot of cultural nuances as well. So moving on to the other topic, and that's, I would say it's the main one. I would like to share with you two sources. Culture is fascinating, but of course you have to understand a little bit of history and a little bit of the whole environment to be able to understand culture. And I would say this is something also important to bring to the students. We can see the tip of the iceberg. So the way people dress, the way people greet, but trying to understand those cultural dimensions. And once again, there are many similarities in South America, but there are many, many cultural differences, just like the US and Canada, or the US and the UK, that they seem to be similar, but on the other hand, they are not. Yes. So for example, even greeting, in terms of culture, when I took students to Brazil, now the undergrad a few years ago, we studied a lot about Brazil. I had a group of 23 American students, and we studied all these environment before traveling to Brazil. When we studied culture, we had 3 classes or 4 about culture. One of the things was about the top of the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, and how people greet is one artifact. And people greet with 2 or 3 kisses in Brazil. And I told my students, well, if you don't feel comfortable, just let the Brazilians know, but let them know in a very gentle way because it's more relationship oriented. So no, professor, we are fine. We are going to be okay. They went to Brazil. Everything went great. We had a case competition with Brazilian students, and Brazilian students came here to the US to attend some classes. They didn't do their homework as we did before going there. And they went to a party here and started kissing everybody on the cheeks. Yes, that was very uncomfortable for the people who were at the party here. And they almost got into a fight. It's like, hey, you were kissing all the girls here. You were kissing everybody. Are you hitting on my girlfriend? And they almost got into a fight. Next day, they were in my office and they were like, Professor, it's so important. We almost got into a fight. We have to understand more about the cultural differences. And this has to do with personal space. While here in the US, we have a lot of like space, 1 arm's length. In Brazil or in some other countries in South America, they are all like, it's only 6 inches. You get very close. It's okay to hug. It's okay to kiss. But it's uncomfortable if you are not used to that, right? So 2 sources of information that I added here. Actually, this is my recommendation. If you want to go study culture, there is a book called The Culture Map by Ari Meyer, which is amazing. I would say in terms of the culture, historical, academic background, that's the newest. She published in 2014, but it's a great book, very easy to read and very easy to use with the students because she has a tool. But I also, but you have to pay for the book. The students have to read the book, and then you also have to pay to access her platform, the Culture Map platform. So I added here two other sources, two other cultural framework that I really enjoy. One is Hofstede, and I use with my students. And the other one is GlobeSmart, which actually I got, I requested in a month free access, so you can use and see how it goes. You can use with your students. And it's very, very useful for cultural dimensions. So cultural environment, well, as I'm in South America, they tend to be much more relationship oriented. In some countries, like Brazil, it's much more flexible time. It's okay to change your time. In some others, it's more linear time, as we are here. There are many different ways to build trust, if it's cognitive trust or affective trust. And I would say, but in most of them, it's much more indirect communication. So in Hofstede, you have the website that you can use for free. And I'm going to show you in a little bit the website. We see that in many of these countries, and I added here just the biggest economic countries in South America, because you can only add up to 4 countries, you can compare them in 6 different cultural dimensions. One of them is power distance. So the lower the number, more egalitarian the country is, and the highest the number, the more status-oriented. There is more power difference. So I would say in many of these countries, well, Argentina is quite in the middle, but in many countries in South America, it's not okay to challenge your superiors. Like here at Kelley, I can talk to the dean's office directly. In Brazil, that would be very uncomfortable. I would have to talk to my boss. My boss will talk to somebody else, and then it goes in different levels until you get the message to the dean. Yes, or for example, in families. There is a specific place where the boss of the family can be the father or the mother or the grandfather or grandmother. They would sit at the table, and you can see that in many different artifacts too, who has the best office, who has the photos of important people. So this is all about power distance. In most countries there are. Then another trend in South American countries, but of course there is a big difference here when we compare Peru and Argentina, is how collectivist is the country or how individualist is the country. Is it about the group, the collective, and here Peru is much more about the collective, the group, than Argentina, which is in the middle. Yes, it's kind of between individualist and collectivist, but the US is much more individualist. So this is important too, but you can see big differences. The third one, and then it's not about gender. Actually, there's another framework called the Globe Project that talks about gender. So this dimension makes people confused sometimes. It's about masculinity and femininity. And masculine cultures, they are much more about assertiveness, or you live to work, as we are here in the US. So in consulting, you would work 60 hours per week, up to 80 hours per week. And in feminine countries, it's a nurturing society. It's about caring for the others. And it's about you work to live. Yes, you don't live to work, as in masculine society. So we can see also a big difference. Argentina is much more masculine than comparing to Chile, where it's more balance between your professional and your personal life. And Argentina is more in the middle, tending more to masculinity. So it's like a higher number, a higher assertiveness, or more competitive society. Interestingly, the next one, this is something very common in South American countries, is the uncertainty, high scores in uncertainty avoidance. How, because of all the political instability, because of all the currency changes, because of the inflation, there is a high level people tend to feel more threatened with ambiguous situations in countries with the higher score in uncertainty avoidance. So I would say if you add here some other countries, they would be the same. So whenever you're dealing with contracts, doing business in that country, how would you make it more comfortable or less uncertain to that other partner from that culture? Another trend is to have more short-term orientation. And once again, this is because of all the changes, currency, political. Most countries are here more short-term than long-term. So I would say when I used to take executives to China, which is a very long-term orientation culture, my Brazilian executives, they would say like, oh, we want to close a business right now. Even though they're only in 44, they're kind of in the middle, but more on short-term. And while in China, you have to build trust. It would take 2-3 years to close a business deal. And the Brazilians were more anxious, they were more short-term. They wanted the results faster than there. The last one, it's indulgence versus restraint. Most countries, they fall here in the indulgence group, like that dimension. And that means they value their free time, they spend as they wish, they enjoy having fun, while in more indulgent societies, well, Peru is high in the middle, you feel suppressed by spending money on fun, on yourself. So it's, but I would say most countries are indulgent, which is very important for some industries, such as the entertainment industry as well. So this is the website. Let me show you here the website where you can use with your students, or you can use to do some research, and you can compare the countries. He has this country comparison country, and sometimes it works with some browsers and it doesn't work with others. And we can add here, for example, get here Bolivia, Brazil. We can add the USA and compare United States. And then this is a very important tool to use and to understand more culture and how to differentiate. They also have a qualitative analysis. When we see here indulgence, US and Brazil are kind of similar. The new data, it brings more difference, but it's for different reasons. So in the qualitative part, we can read about that. Then you can also compare, for example, individualism. United States is very high individualism, and then Bolivia or Brazil was, as I mentioned, most countries are more collectivist. This is important for our students to be aware, because how you work in teams, and not only work in teams, but how you are working with a different team in the country to do business in the country, or if you have somebody from Bolivia studying your class and you were going to work together, how this matters to work as a group. Yes, to understand these as a group. And the last one that I wanted to share is GlobeSmart. So this is the link that I was able to get to for a month for free access. I really, I strongly recommend you to take a look, to have access. You fill in a questionnaire with 40 questions about yourself. They have in many different, I think 15 different languages as well. So very interesting source of information. This one is paid, but we have a month here and you can take a look. This is one that I also use a lot with the students, and differently than Hofstede, where Hofstede is more, we can compare the countries, and Hofstede was able to research people at at IBM, so kind of excluding the organizational culture. It was very interesting. Here, this is updated on a daily basis. As whenever I ask my students to use GlobeSmart, it's being updated. And you can compare yourself with your teammates. You can compare yourself with the school you're in. So they can compare what is the, well, if you think about the US, there are huge cultural differences, right? Well, I was in Fargo, I was in Atlanta, I'm in Indiana, and I can notice some cultural differences. So they can compare that with their teammates as well. So these cultural dimensions, some of them are similar to Hofstede and some are different. So independent versus independent could be more like individualism, collectivism. And we can see that most countries in South America, they tend to go to the right side, more interdependent. And even at work, having lunch, it's never an activity that you do by yourself. You always go with your colleagues. Even to go to the pharmacy, that's funny, you never go by yourself. When I was living in Brazil, it was very common that you go to a hair salon or a nail salon and the spouse is waiting for you to finish the service. This is the extent of how interdependent the society is. It's always about doing things together. Actually, my friends in Brazil, I'm more in the US side in this point, I'm more independent. But my friends call me, is like, are you okay having lunch by yourself, going to the movies by yourself? It's like, yeah, it's fine. I need that. I'm more independent. But this is something the opposite side. It's very interdependent in Brazil. If somebody's going to the movies by himself or herself, they would always ask, what's going on? Yeah. We can see status and egalitarianism, very similar to power distance. So most countries, they fall into the status orientation, with the exception of Argentina, that it's more, a little bit more egalitarian. This is different than uncertainty avoidance. Here, it's certainty and risk. So here, the risk, it's about you value the speed, making decisions quickly, while in more certainty oriented cultures, you take time, you value more the process itself, and you make a decision when you have more data. Then we have direct and indirect communication. As I mentioned, most countries, they also fall into the indirect. So what do they really mean by that sentence? And one of the reasons too, it's not only language, but you have to be indirect so you don't hurt the feelings of your co-workers, of your team, because it's so interdependent. One example of that is peer evaluations. I do a lot of peer evaluations here with teamwork, and the students are very, very honest. Yeah, this student only got 50%, and I have some students who get very bad grades because they didn't work, and the team really points that out. In Brazil, that would never work. I tried to do peer evaluations. I taught there for more than 15 years because it's about the relationship. They might have another class later on, 1 year, 2 years later, and they don't want to hurt the feelings. They don't want to be the snitch and give a bad grade to a student who was slacking. So that impacts a lot of things, including teaching as well. Or here in more direct cultures such as the US, we mean what we say. We say when we start the presentation, you have to tell what is the program of the day. We follow a script. In Brazil, it's more indirect. In some cultures, it's more indirect and it's flexible time. So you can shift. If the students are not interested in culture and we had to talk about the economic environment, we could talk more about the economic environment and skip, even though that was on the script. Yes. And the last one would be more task or relationship. Sometimes students ask me, oh, so if they are all about relationship, they won't accomplish the task. No, it's not that way. It's because here we are more task oriented. We have a teamwork, we get together, we sit, we finish the work, and you don't talk to that teammate very likely in the future. And in relationship cultures, you have to first build that effective trust, and then you are going to get your work done. Yes, so task is accomplished too. And I will give another example. It's very common in countries in South America, where when you leave your company, you've been working there for 2-3 years, you still keep in touch with your coworkers. It's not that they were just a task part of your life. They were at that point, but they keep. So I would say my friend who's in Panama now, we worked together in 1996, 97 together at Philips, but we are friends yet. So that's an example of relationship building. Or it would be very common to do business in Colombia or Bolivia and be invited, or even Brazil, and be invited to the wedding of the son of the person you are negotiating, because personal life and work life, they are mixed. Yeah, so this is another good example of relationship. I want to point out, when we are comparing these cultures, an important aspect of cultural relativity. When I'm saying countries are more this or that, I'm comparing always to the US. That's the concept of cultural relativity. We tend to see the country based on our own culture. But if you ask somebody from India, and India would be right here on status, they would be more on the status side, they would say, oh, South American countries, they are more egalitarian. Yeah, so this is the concept of cultural relativity that we have to be careful with. Or for example, here in Argentina, they would say, oh, people in Colombia are very status oriented, and but maybe somebody who's closer would see in a different perspective. So this is an important thing. The other one is when we talk to students and we show them all these cultural dimensions, and we talk about them, we have to make sure we don't create stereotypes. Doesn't mean that everybody in Brazil is more like status oriented or is more indirect. All those frameworks, they are like a bell. So you have people at the tails, and you might find somebody in Bolivia who is much more risk oriented than somebody in Argentina, and vice versa. You can find somebody in Argentina who is much more indirect than somebody in Bolivia because they are at the tails. This is just an average. And then we can see big differences. When we were talking about Hofstede and masculinity and femininity, I can clearly see some cities in Brazil or even here in the US. So New York is a very masculine oriented city, or Chicago, while Bloomington could be a little bit less than New York, or Rio is much more feminine. São Paulo is more masculine, or is more indulgent too. Rio would be more indulgent than Rio. But we use countries because it's not the perfect way, but the best way of describing a culture, because of we share the same political environment, the same economic environment, many times the language, but not always. So it gives us a good base, but we have to be careful not to stereotype. Yeah. Even Belgium, and I'm not only talking about the US or Brazil or India, China, large countries, but even in Belgium, which is a very small country, we have cultural differences between the Flemish area, the French area, and the frameworks. You cannot do a framework per city or per region. It would be impossible. That's why I like GlobeSmart, because you can do some comparisons, but it's the best way to describe a national culture. So I only have a couple more minutes. So I wanted to show you how it's GlobeSmart, how it works. I was logged out, but let me log in here and I will show you. And you can use this access for free. Oops. And you can test it out. So let me show you here, GlobeSmart. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my GlobeSmart screen? Approved. So it's not only about the frameworks, just these like and once again, this is a matter of preference as well. Some students like the number and they would go for the Hofstede. Some other students would like the image and they like GlobeSmart better. But they have a Friday, okay, 15th of September. You can see here, you can compare, you can create your profile, and then they give you some recommendations, and then you can go here and let me go back and do a new comparison. I can add countries. I can add Argentina. I can add Bangladesh, and I can create the profiles. The other very important aspect of GlobeSmart is that you can take a look at the culture guide. And in the culture guide, you have access to a lot of different information about the culture. For example, culture impacts how you how you lead, yes, or how you motivate people. Some more task-oriented cultures, they would be led by some different aspects, by different skills than in more relationship-oriented cultures. So here you can, and I'm going to send here the link. So here you can compare. In Brazil, there was a version previous to this one that I printed. There were more than 80 pages just about cultural influence in business for Brazil. And you have here more than 100 countries. So if we go here, leading people, what are the leadership styles that work in Argentina based on culture? How do you recruit and hire? It's much more about the relationship, for example, in Brazil, and I would say paternalism or nepotism, which is accepted, it's okay, while here it would be the other way. Yes, you would not accept hiring somebody who is related to you, or some people would look at a different way because of this cultural difference. So how you give feedback, yes, which is also interesting. Not always a country that it's direct communication gives feedback directly. The US is a clear example of that. We are very direct, but we give feedback more indirectly, negative feedback. We have the sandwich, say something good, say something bad, and they say something good. So there are some cases like that. And then you can see here what is the right way of giving feedback. For example, I would say in most countries, in South America, you give your feedback in private, never in front of anyone, because of the relationship-oriented status, because of status, because of they are more interdependent. So it's important to understand that. Or for example, here, how do you motivate? Building teamwork. So there is a lot of information. And this is only, I was just opening here in leading people, but you can find a lot of information that can be used. And also, so students can compare themselves in these groups. They can compare themselves to the different countries, and they can take some quizzes if they test my knowledge about the country. So that would be a good way of exploring GlobeSmart. So I have 4 minutes, but I will leave more time for questions. So if you have any questions, let me share my other screen. If you have any questions, I'm all ears.